I never imagined my life would come to this, a woman in her mid-40s standing alone in a beautiful house feeling more invisible than ever. My husband was always gone, his business trip stretched from days into weeks, and when he did return his presence felt more like a formality than a reunion. We barely spoke beyond small talk. Intimacy was something we hadn't shared in years. I kept up appearances, cooked, cleaned, smiled at neighbors, but inside I was fading. It was early spring when my husband told me he'd be leaving again, this time for nearly a month. I nodded, pretending to understand. As always, I didn't protest. I never did. I had accepted this life, or at least I thought I had. Just a week after he left, my stepson Aiden returned from college for spring break. He was 22, tall, polite, and had always kept a respectful distance. I had raised him since he was in middle school, so our relationship had always been a quiet, formal bond, but now he was a man, and something about the way he looked at me had changed. It wasn't inappropriate, not at first, but it was different. I noticed his eyes lingered a little longer. His compliments, once casual, now felt personal. "You look beautiful today," he said one morning in the kitchen, his voice warm. I laughed it off, but my heart fluttered. We started spending more time together, mostly by coincidence. He'd help with groceries, offer to cook dinner with me, and sit beside me during late-night TV shows. I tried to ignore the growing tension, but I wasn't blind. I felt it. Every time his hand brushed against mine, every time he stood just a little too close. One evening we sat on the porch watching the sunset. He told me he admired how I held the family together, how strong I was for his father. I didn't know how to respond. I had never been praised like that, not in years. Something about his voice, gentle but honest, cut through the wall I had built around myself. I looked at him and saw more than my stepson. I saw a man who saw me, a man who noticed I was alive that night. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying our conversations, the way he looked at me, the way I didn't pull away. I told myself it was harmless, but deep down I knew I was lying. I knew this was more than loneliness. I had crossed an emotional line I could no longer deny. When I saw him again the next morning, his smile made me nervous. I was beginning to crave that attention, that feeling of being wanted, even if it was wrong. For the first time in a long while I felt awake, but I also felt afraid. I hadn't done anything, not yet, but I knew I was close, and if something didn't stop me soon, I wasn't sure I'd be able to walk away from what was coming. It happened on a Thursday evening. The house was quiet, and the air felt heavier than usual. I had just finished dinner when the rain started falling hard, followed by a sudden power outage with no lights, no distractions, and only candles for warmth. The atmosphere shifted. Aiden walked into the living room. "I'm holding 2 glasses of wine. Thought you could use this," he said, smiling gently. I hesitated, but took the glass. We sat in silence, the only sound being the rain tapping against the windows. The wine loosened my guard, and our conversation drifted from memories to emotions. He opened up about how lost he'd felt lately, how much he appreciated being home, and how being around me made him feel safe. I listened, comforted by the honesty. Then he said something that stopped me cold. "You don't even realize how incredible you are, do you?" I looked at him confused, but he didn't look away. "You deserve someone who sees you," he continued. "Someone who actually makes you feel alive." My heart pounded. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell him this was inappropriate, but I didn't. Instead, I let his words soak in. I was starving for affection, for validation, and at that moment, it didn't matter who was giving it. I told him that sometimes I felt like I was fading in this house, like no one really saw me anymore. He reached for my hand, held it gently, and I didn't pull away. It felt so natural, so quiet, like we had arrived here not by choice, but by force of circumstance. His touch wasn't forceful. It wasn't aggressive. It was tender and sincere. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. His eyes weren't just looking at me, they were holding me, filling in the spaces my husband had long abandoned. He leaned closer. I should have stopped him, but I didn't. Our lips touched softly, slowly. It was a kiss that said more than words ever could. It wasn't wild or rushed. It was deep and full of emotions we had both buried. When it ended, we sat in silence, both knowing we had crossed a boundary. We Couldn't undo. I stood up, said I needed to go to bed, and left him sitting there without another word, but sleep didn't come. My heart raced, my thoughts spiraled. I knew what we had done was wrong. It wasn't just a kiss, it was betrayal, not just of my husband, but of everything I thought I stood for, and yet a part of me didn't feel regret. A part of me felt awakened, seen, touched in a way I had forgotten was possible. I couldn't explain it, I didn't even want to, but I knew that nothing would be the same again. Something inside of me had shifted, something I could never put back. The next morning, I avoided eye contact. I moved through the kitchen like everything was normal, but nothing felt the same. Aiden entered the room casually, but I noticed the change in his demeanor, calm, confident, like a line had been crossed, and he wasn't sorry for it. He offered to help with breakfast. I nodded without looking up. The tension between us was silent but undeniable. We didn't speak of the kiss, neither of us brought it up, but it hung in the air like a secret too loud to ignore. I kept telling myself it was just a moment, a weak lapse in judgment, but when his hand brushed against mine again, I didn't move. When he stood close behind me to reach for a plate, I felt my body react, shame and excitement. Later that day, I caught him watching me, not in a careless way, but with intention. His eyes studied me, my face, my movements. Every detail, like it mattered. I hadn't felt that kind of attention in years, not from my husband, not from anyone. It was wrong, I knew it, but I couldn't stop myself from wanting more of it. Aiden began spending more time at home than with his friends. He made excuses to be near me, movie nights, errands, walks. Our conversations deepened. He asked about my childhood, my dreams, what I had given up over the years. I realized how much of myself I had buried for the sake of a marriage that gave me nothing back. I tried to set boundaries. I told him this couldn't continue, that it was dangerous and reckless. He listened, nodded, even apologized, but the next moment he found me alone. He whispered that he couldn't stop thinking about me, that I deserved more than being left behind by a man who didn't even notice when I cried myself to sleep. Every word felt like a needle stitching me back together. One night, he touched my face and said, "You don't have to keep pretending. You're allowed to feel something again." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The way I looked at him said enough. The emotional line had long been crossed. What followed wasn't planned, it was inevitable. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I was a woman torn between guilt and desire, between loyalty and the aching need to be wanted. I told myself I was still in control, that I could stop this before it went too far, but the truth was I had already fallen. Yet I feared the consequences, not just of being found out, but of what would happen when he left again, when his break ended, and I would be alone in this house once more. Would he take this version of me with him, or would I be left broken again, this time by mistake I could never undo? Aiden's break was coming to an end, and the weight of what we had done began to press harder on both of us. I could see it in his quiet moments, the way he looked at me, but said less. Something about our silence now felt heavier, not intimate, guilty. He started packing, and with every folded shirt I felt pieces of my fragile world collapsing. We had crossed a line, yes, but what now? We never spoke about what would happen next. He didn't promise anything, and I didn't ask. I didn't want illusions. I had lived long enough wrapped in false security with a husband who barely noticed me, but this was different. It was raw, intense, and wrong, but real, and now it had to end. The night before his departure, he came to me, unsure for the first time since this began. He didn't reach for me, he just looked at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't. "I don't regret anything," he said quietly, "but I don't want to ruin your life either." I nodded, unable to respond. My throat tightened. I wasn't sure if it was heartbreak or relief. When he left the next morning, I stood at the door like a stranger. Someone walked out of her life without ceremony. No goodbyes, no promises, just a moment cut short. The house returned to its stillness, but this time it felt colder. Days passed, and my husband returned as if nothing had changed. He brought back souvenirs, stories from meetings, spoke about business deals over dinner. He didn't notice the way I avoided his eyes. He didn't notice how hollow I'd become. I had given myself to someone else, emotionally and physically, and it showed, but only to me. At first I thought I'd be consumed by guilt, but instead I felt an aching sadness, not just for what I had done, but for the years I had wasted feeling invisible. The betrayal wasn't just in the kiss or the Touch it was in realizing that someone who wasn't even supposed to matter had seen me more clearly in a week than my husband had in years. Aiden texted once a simple message, "Take care of yourself." I stared at it for hours before deleting it. I knew we couldn't continue, and I also knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. I had changed, and that change wasn't something I could reverse. In the end, I was left with a marriage still intact on the surface, but completely hollow inside. I lived each day beside a man who thought everything was fine, while I carried the weight of choices I couldn't take back. And maybe that's the real punishment, not being caught but having to live with the truth in silence. I learned that love without attention is just habit, and attention without commitment is just temptation. Somewhere in between I lost a version of myself I'll never get.